Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Glennis Young, Chair of the Department of History, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our panel on sports and civil rights history. Before I introduce our moderator, Professor Alexis Harris, I would like to express my thanks to the History Department staff who have made this event possible, especially to Josh Apfel and Alexandra Colley and all of the others who have worked behind the scenes. Thank you so much. So it's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce our moderator, Professor Alexis Harris. She is the Presidential Term Professor and Professor of Sociology at the University of Washington. Her research fundamentally centers on issues of inequality, poverty, and race in the United States criminal legal systems. Her book, A Pound of Flesh, Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for the Poor, details the ways in which sentence, fines, and fees often put an undue burden on disadvantaged populations and places them under even greater supervision of the criminal justice system. She's been appointed to serve on several federal advisory boards and has been inducted into the Washington State Academy of Sciences. In 2018, she was given the University of Washington's highest award, the Distinguished Teaching Award. She is also uniquely qualified to be our moderator today. In 2019, she was appointed as the University of Washington's faculty representative for athletics. And since 2011, she has worked with UW Athletics and has served as chair from 2014 to 2019. So welcome, Professor Harris. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this discussion. I'm excited to have this very important conversation. I'd like to acknowledge that I am sitting on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. All of us in some form, or wherever we're at in the United States today, are sitting on native lands, and it's important to acknowledge that. I'll begin by introducing our distinguished panelists today. Dawn Trudeau has been the co-owner of the Women's National Basketball Association team, the Seattle Storm, since 2008. She served as chairperson of Force 10 Hoops from 2009 to 2013 and currently chairs the Seattle Storm Foundation Board. Dawn is a former Microsoft Corporation executive committed to assuring that women and girls have the opportunity to compete at any level. Braden Bishop is an American professional baseball outfielder for the Seattle Mariners Major League Baseball team. He is a Husky. He attended the University of Washington and played baseball for the Huskies from 2013 to 2015. He is a founder of For Mom, a charity dedicated to spreading awareness about Alzheimer's disease, inspired by his mother Susie's struggle with early onset Alzheimer's disease. David Zirin is an American political sports writer and the sports editor for The Nation magazine. He is the author of 11 books on the politics of sports, including A People's History of Sports in the United States and Game Over, How Politics Has Turned the Sports World Upside Down. His forthcoming book, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World, will be available in September 2021. Dr. Louis Moore teaches African American history, civil rights, sports history, and the U.S. history at Grand Valley State University. He is the author of 2 recently published books, I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Manhood between 1880 and 1915, and We Will Win the Day, the civil rights movement, the Black athlete, and the quest for equality. Dr. Moore has also written for a number of online outlets and has appeared on news outlets talking about sports and race. Professor Moore just received notice that his promotion to full professor was recently approved. So congratulations, Professor Moore. Dr. David Leonard is a writer, teacher, scholar.
Leonard, sorry, that was me before, joking.
Leonard, I know. You turned me off.
Sorry. It's my fault.
Dr. David Leonard is a writer, teacher, scholar, and professor at Washington State University. He is I should give our fellow Wazoo faculty more respect. I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name. He is the author of several books, including Playing While White, Privilege and Power on and Off the Field, and After Arrest, our test, the NBA and the Assault on Blackness. So we have wonderful speakers, and I just want to set the stage for our conversation. As we all know, our country is in the midst of experiencing and witnessing so many social inequities, such as police killings of Black people that we've seen on videos, unequal treatment and pay of women in general, but specifically in sports, health inequities that COVID has highlighted, in housing and food insecurity. We are in a critical moment that is so ripe for change. We've been protesting in the streets, and we've moved to challenge the laws and processes that demanding reform and real structural change. As we know, pivotal social movements like the ones we are currently in have been highlighted throughout our history by so many great people who happen to be athletes. For example, Muhammad Ali, termed the greatest professional boxer, but at the height of his career, many in this country shunned him, sent him death threats because of his refusal to be drafted into the US military and to fight in the Vietnam War. Mr. Ali said in 1967, quote, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights?" He went on to say, "No, I am not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of white slave masters and the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evil must come to an end. I have been warned that to take such a stand would put my prestige in jeopardy and could cause me to lose millions of dollars, which should accrue to me as a champion. But I have said it once and I will say it again, the real enemy of my people is right here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality." These were powerful words at the time, and it's important to remember that while today he is lauded, but in 1967 he was hated. More recently, our nation has borne witness to the powerful stance of Colin Kaepernick with his taking a knee, and the WNBA dedicated their 2020 season to social justice to honor the Black Lives Movement and the Say Her Name campaign. We've seen how sports leaders can take a stand and use their voices to advocate for real change. And this is the focus of our conversation today. We will talk with folks who study the history of sports and those who are actively engaged in professional sports to think about how leaders today can take a stand. What are they risking when they engage? What should they be risking and what they be asking for? So with that, I will ask each of our panelists the same question, and I'll call your name just in order on my screen so that there's no confusion. What is your perspective on the role of sports in the history of civil rights? And Dawn Trudeau, we'll begin with you, please.
Well, you gave some great examples. Muhammad Ali is certainly a great example, but even if you go back, Jackie Robinson took a tremendous amount of abuse, being the first Black person in the MLB. And he blazed the trails, though, for other people. He also gave credit to the Black race in terms of their athletic ability, which was really doubted before that time. So he was another one of those people that really created history and created opportunity in his wake. And then in the 1968 Olympics, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, stood on the award stand and raised their fist. It's not surprising that so many of the people that are blazing trails in the history of sports are Black people, because they've had to fight their way throughout their careers in many cases, and Colin Kaepernick being another great example. And then more recently, in 2016, after Alton Sterling and Philandro Castile were killed by police, the Minnesota Lynx and the WNBA were the first people to wear Black Lives Matter warm-up shirts. They were fined by the league for doing that because they were out of uniform. And our players then asked if they could wear Black Lives Matter shirts at our next game. And we said, yes, and we'll pay your fines. But there was enough pressure on the league that the league eventually reversed those fines and said they understood what was going on and why people were saying that they wanted to highlight Black Lives Matter. And then, of course, there's lots of examples of breaking through with social justice. Becky Hammon, who was an ex-WNBA player, who's the first woman to be a head coach in an NBA game. There's lots of examples of sports breaking molds and breaking norms to really help propel forth human and social justice.
Sorry, my mute, it gets stuck. Braden, what are your perspectives on the role of sports in the history of civil rights?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be on this panel. I mean, as a current athlete, I'm definitely excited to learn more. And being a current athlete, I think I have a unique view, especially last summer, with everything that was going on, the movements around the country, and then being a part of the team that ended up boycotting in San Diego last year and not playing a game was one of the most eye-opening experiences in my history, and just knowing the history of of movements throughout the United States. To know we had 9 African American players at the time, and to see them all, I mean, it was like a movie, honestly, to see them walk right into our manager's office and basically say, hey, we're not going to play today. You could feel the power of that moment, and knew that it would be one for history. I'm assuming that same moment happened in multiple clubhouses and locker rooms around different sports. And then to have Dee Gordon, who was, our leader at the time, basically stand up, and he was sobbing and telling the team that, you guys can think what you want, but you don't. Majority of our team was white, obviously. Saying you don't wear my skin, you don't know this pain, while he's sobbing, and saying, you might think, I have millions of dollars and I got it great, but I have to do this for my family and my daughter and my cousins, and so to see that, and I've been part of this fight for far longer than that moment, but to see that personal trauma that somebody who's had so much success in this country, I think it really moved the needle in our clubhouse, predominantly white, that this is an issue, and it's historical, and you have the choice of what side you want to stand on, because 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, you're either going to be known as on the right side or the wrong side. And so it was encouraging to see guys not be on the side of resistance, and join in with our guys.
Powerful. Dave Zirin.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. So Alexis, just make a huge hand motion like this if you want me to be quiet, and I'll take that as our secret code. I have studied a lot of sports history and the civil rights movement. It's been an interest of mine since I was in college, and a basketball player named Mahmoud Abdul Rauf made the decision that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem. And that really changed me. I was a sports obsessive. I never gave much thought to the politics of sports or how one resists racism through sports. But seeing the courage of Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, it sent me on a journey of trying to learn this history. And one of the things I learned, big picture, is that from practically the beginning of organized sports in this country, there was a contradiction baked right into the cake. And that's the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. I mean, on the one hand, when organized sports, and I want to be clear when I say organized sports, when that started in the 19th century, it was billed and marketed as the best possible expression of the United States, that anyone, if they were good enough, could take the field and succeed. But on the other hand, if you were a woman, no sports for you. If you were black or brown, form your own leagues or don't play at all, just stay out of the way. But as black and brown folks, indigenous folks, and women in the 19th century began to fight for access to sports, they immediately made it a contested space, a space where athletes demanded access and equity and to level the unlevel playing field. So from the beginning, the very platform of sports becomes a space for more than just fun and games. It becomes this contested terrain, a battle between inclusion and exclusion. And through that battle, it becomes a platform for both sides. It's become a platform for some franchise owners to express their beliefs, which often, not always, certainly, I'm speaking with Dawn here, I have to say often, not always, have revolved around exclusion and also their brand of patriotism, militarism, corporatism. But it's also from the beginning, was almost the exact beginning, was a platform for athletes to fight not only for access to play, but also to express dissent to the way things are, not just in the sports world, but the real world. And that's why we can't think of the civil rights movement without thinking of Jackie Robinson, or the 1960s without thinking of Ali Smith or Carlos, or the women's liberation movement of the 1970s without Billie Jean King. And today, the struggle of women and Black and brown folks and people with disabilities has become a similar struggle for access by LGBTQ people, most critically trans athletes who are being absolutely dragged through the mud because they want to play sports. It's become an obsession of one of our political parties to ban trans athletes from the world of sports, but their fight for access is part of a long tradition. And of course, as mentioned, just as it's impossible to think of the civil rights movement without thinking of Jackie Robinson, it's impossible to think of the Black Lives Matter movement without thinking of Colin Kaepernick first sitting and then taking that fateful knee. But there's so much more. And one of the things that I prepared, but I realize I'm not going to speak about it, it comes from this incredible book called We Will Win the Day by Louis Moore. So better Louis Moore speak about his own work than me to kind of recapitulate and repackage his central arguments. But just to say, one of the things that I got from We Will Win the Day that's so important is that we make, and I really want to underline this in bold letters here, but like we make a big mistake if we see sports as just a reflection of civil rights struggle. If we see sports as just, oh, well, you had struggle in the streets and it reflected itself in the sports world. Because what that does is it erases those struggles, large and small, to integrate sports, to make sports more just, and to fight for a more level playing field. That's what Louis Moore's book talks about. And it's invigorating to know that we actually live and build and organize on this tremendous tradition of athlete activists. We don't have to recreate the wheel. It's a proud tradition and one that extends for as long as there has been professional sports.
Thank you for that. That's a great transition. I'll go to you, Louis.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. And it does come out on paperback in November. So there you go. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, but I'll just follow it with the story about Joe Louis. And I think it's so important, right? As Braden talks about Dee Gordon and Dawn talks about Jackie Robinson and others, and Dave brings up this idea of platform. Joe Louis, if you guys don't know, you guys should know, is the greatest fighter of all time, right? Sorry, Muhammad Ali. And Joe, right, he wins the heavyweight championship in 1937, beating James Braddock or maybe Russell Crowe, as you know. Becomes an American hero by 1938, right, when he beats Max Schmeling. And then during World War II, essentially gives up his boxing career, right, to join the military, not now to actually fight, but promote the war and sell bonds and make sure the double victory campaign for Black Americans, that is victory abroad and victory at home, right, is winnable. But after the war, he's still the heavyweight champion of the world, right? We fight this war for democracy, and yet we're still in Jim Crow. And he decides that, you know what, I'm going to use my platform, right, as Dave suggests, to do something different. And during the late 1940s, why he's heavyweight champion of the world, right, the most popular athlete in all of America is using his platform to fight against the poll tax, right, to fight against Jim Crow, to fight against poverty. And the way he says, the way we're going to defeat all of this is to vote. And he uses his platform to tell other Black folks to take advantage of the vote. Now, what Joe Louis also understands at that time, and what I think many athletes today understand, is that all well and good to say, go out there and vote. But what if you don't have that ability to vote because it's been taken away from you? So part of Joe Louis's campaign to fight for civil rights and Jim Crow is to fight against, right, the poll tax. And I bring that up because this is where we're at now, right? Almost, I can't do the math, I'm a historian, but almost 70 years later, athletes are still fighting for people to vote to fight for their civil rights. And I'll just stop briefly. I'll end this right here with Joe Louis and what he said. And Joe Louis knew that as a professional athlete, as a famous professional athlete, when he stepped out of sports and started to advocate for civil rights, he knew he was going to be attacked. But what Joe Louis said was, look, Lots of people think that I'm doing all right as a fighter and that I should stick to my business. They mean all right, but they don't understand that fighting prejudice, disease, and second-class citizenship is my business too. So what Joe was doing was laying out this platform for other athletes to follow and say, look, it is my business as an athlete and a citizen to fight for everybody.
That's powerful. Thank you for framing it, giving us that framework to think about. David, I'll let you respond.
Well, first off, thank you for the invitation and thank you for everyone's work. So Dave Zirin mentioned how this history we can kind of frame as a history of dissent as part of a struggle for inclusion, inclusion in sports, but also inclusion as participants in society, as of human rights, but also exclusion. And so I want us to think about that framing, but also think about beyond what we often see in history, in pop culture. And that when we think about dissent, we so often think about those signposts in history. We think about those moments, whether it be 1968 with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. We think about various protests over the last 6 years with various players in the WNBA and the NBA wearing shirts. We think about various moments that encapsulate, obviously we think about Kaepernick. We think about these moments as encapsulating these movements. Yet every one of those moments has a broader history, a history of organizing, a history of agitation, a history of ongoing conversations, of work, so often throughout history, inside and outside sports, carried out by women. And so I want us to think, and Black women specifically. And so we need to understand that history of organizing. We need to understand the centrality of Black women in that struggle. We need to understand the interface and the connective tissue between, and this is what Dave Zirin references with Dr. Louis Moore's work, that there's not a disconnect between the sports world and the other world, but the connective tissue between those worlds. That when the Washington football team integrated, that was because of activism by players, by the Black press, and by so many others. That when we look at the change of name of that Washington football team, that is a struggle that took place in multiple spaces. And so I think it's important to think about the dissent that's taking place at a number of levels. In terms of exclusion, I think so often we think about exclusion and inclusion as a binary and don't push ourselves to look beyond the symbolic. And so as Dave Zirin noted, we can look at sport not just as athletes and dissent, but we can look at it in terms of the way in which sports enterprises, teams, leagues have served as a space for the perpetuation of injustice. And that's irrespective of public pronouncements. You know, we can look at various teams who might embrace statements of Black Lives Matter. Yet, if we look at the policies that, you know, individuals support or the business ventures that they have, whether it be mass incarceration or militarism or gentrification or so much more, we see the ways in which sports also perpetuates injustice. And so it's both the struggle for justice and a space in which injustice happens both on and off the field.
Thank you for that. I mean, there's so many threads that you all have raised that we can talk about. Obviously, we've had clear examples provided of particular athletes or teams, past and current, that have taken a stand, but you've also raised themes around culture and sort of changing the team itself, changing culture with Braden's palpable description of learning experiences from his teammates, but also maybe teams or individuals can set norms around culture for broader society. The theme about individual and athlete versus and a citizen at the same time, right? Sort of having that responsibility of taking a stance. And then David just raised the institutional perspective and how the sort of professional organizations themselves sort of support that corporate nature or the militarized nature that someone else represented. So there's so many directions that we can go in. I'll sort of use that context to help frame the first question that someone submitted. They're presupposing that this exists. So I'm going to kind of reframe the question, but the question is about, do we see more activism in some sports and some leagues than others? And if so, why? I'll throw that to David. You looked excited and reached for the mute button, I'm thinking. No. Okay. How about Dave? Oh, Dawn. I'm sorry, Dawn.
Well, the WNBA is a great example of that, right? It's about women fighting for their place in society. It's a league that has always had to fight for respect, for coverage, for pay, for sponsorship, for broadcast, for all of those kind of things. So, the WNBA gets, the women's sports get 5% of the coverage of sports coverage. So, it's not, our whole existence is about social justice. It's about having a place in society. It's about changing the perception of women. It's about making sure that women are not only have the opportunity to participate, but to lead and to be examples for other people, for men. And so it's one of those things where that's who we are. That's the absolute basis of who we are, both as players in the league, as the league itself, as owners of the of franchises, because it's always been a struggle for women to have equal recognition, equal pay, equal opportunity. So our league is about social justice. It's about great basketball as well. It's a really entertaining game, but it's also a whole lot about just finding a place for us to have our time in society and being role models for other people, to see how you can be both a great athlete and also a social justice warrior.
So to contrast that with the NBA, right? I'll kick this one to you. But to contrast that with the NBA, we might want to say the same about race. But we don't see the NBA is predominantly African American, right? But we don't see necessarily the same united front. Why might that be, Professor Moore?
Oh, hey, I was just gonna be selfish and ask Dawn. Like I think I'll come back to that, but I think the Vote Warnock campaign is one of the most significant things that's ever happened in athlete activism. And in real time, I was wondering if you, as an owner, saw that, like how big of an impact your players and your organization was making at that moment, because 4 months later, it changed the course of American history.
Oh, absolutely. We saw that. Just to go back to the 2020 season, our players negotiated with the league that if we could not make that season about social justice, and particularly about Say Her Name, because so much of the coverage of police killing Black people, it was about men, and the women were kind of getting swept under the rug. So the players said, we'll play this season, but we'll play it if it's about social justice, if it's about Say Her Name, if it's about Black Lives Matter. And so then we had, you may or may not know this background, but we had one of the owners of the Atlanta team, who was current senator, reject the Black Lives Matter, basically, in my personal opinion, mischaracterize it, and basically say that she disagreed with the league allowing the players to have that kind of a voice. And so I thought that our players were brilliant. Actually, it was Sue Bird's idea to do the Vote Warnock t-shirts. Instead of fighting against her, they just stopped saying her name. And they started saying somebody else's name, and they did it wasn't just because he was running against Kelly Loeffler. It was because he represents the values that the team and the leagues believe were really important. And so they were very, very intentional about doing it. It was an incredible success, as you said, but it was also one of those things where that, again, as I say, we can't separate in our league social justice from the work that we do. There's no way we'll ever shut up and dribble, as has been said of other people. So it's one of those things where absolutely intentional, absolutely supported it, and we're very proud of our league and our team.
Dave.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we got a great window of where we're at and how different sports and different leagues operate. in August of 2020 after the Kenosha, Wisconsin police shot Jacob Blake in the back, and you saw the Milwaukee Bucks inside the bubble withdraw their labor during the playoffs and basically say, we're going on strike for Black lives. And then, not too surprisingly, other NBA teams followed suit and the WNBA followed suit. And I was following all of this in real time and reporting on it. And then you could have knocked me over with a feather, with all respect to Braden, when I saw that Major League Baseball did the same. And you see, and that to me was a very significant moment, because these leagues do have different traditions. On the, one way to look at it is, well, this is a movement for Black lives, and the NBA and the NFL, I mean, they're centered around Black people, Black bodies, Black sacrifice, Black genius in so many respects. Baseball, less so, if we're talking about Black Americans, less so. But at the same time, we're also seeing that courage is contagious. And even if different leagues can have different political traditions, some of which are more conservative than others, we also are seeing right now, and this is very exciting. I think it's the first time we've seen this since really the 1960s. And in a lot of ways, it's even wider than the 1960s, is you're seeing different athletes start to get into networks with other athletes in different sports, different informal organizations, different conversations, different influences. So while you may have some leagues leading the way, it's not like other leagues are in this hermetically sealed bubble apart from what athletes in the NBA are doing or what Colin Kaepernick did in the NFL. It's deeply interconnected. Some of that has to do with social media. Some of that has to do with the level of crisis we're living in the United States. And some of it has to do with just the fact that athletes also don't live in a hermetically sealed bubble from society, and they're drawing influence from their athletic people in other leagues even.
I'm going to go to another question that someone raised that relates to sort of what you've been talking about, and that's the financial aspect of the aims of these professional organizations. So please talk, if you could, about the money-making side of this issue and the folks who are benefiting from it, such as recruits, players, recruiters, managers, and their administrative teams, the attorneys and financial advisors who are supposed to protect the players. How can the system be transformed so that the money-making machine of BIPOC recruited, supported sports doesn't function as another form of slavery? Anyone want to lean into that? So some of you have linked the commercialism and the capitalism associated with professional sports teams. Can you talk? Does anyone want to talk about the connection of raising profit with, as I think Dave referenced, Black bodies disproportionately in some leagues?
Well, the NFL has historically been quite conservative, and their sponsors have been quite conservative, and their advertisers are conservative. And so you could see with Colin Kaepernick, it wasn't that he wasn't a great quarterback. He was a great quarterback. It was because they were protecting the commercial interests of the league and of the teams. That was clear. It wasn't about disrespecting the flag. It was about the commerce that goes behind the NFL and all of the people that are supporting it and around it. And so I think that was just a poster child for the commercialization and the desire or the willingness to sacrifice one of their best players in order to protect those commercial interests.
Mm-hmm. But it's so interesting that we saw the MLB fighting back against Georgia, right? And that, so what does it take to have that organizing that sort of, Dawn, you referenced in the WNBA? What does it take to have that organizing that happened that we saw in the MLB to happen more across other professional sports leagues?
I would just say they got to care, right? And so much about these professional organizations. We just saw it last night or yesterday with the Oakland A's, right? It is what can we get first from the public, right? And how can we hijack money from the public to build these billion-dollar stadiums, and not give back. But if we look at it, and now Dave wrote a fantastic piece for, I believe, MSNBC, that part of the history of these leagues is the power to fight back, right? So when MLB pulls out of Georgia, they're just following, this kind of the history of the power that professional sports has. And I talk about this in the book, but in the 1960s, you don't get the movement of the Braves from Milwaukee to Atlanta. You don't get MLB putting a baseball team in Houston. You don't get NFL team in New Orleans and whatever teams come out of Atlanta without these professional leagues putting pressure on cities, right? To say, look, we're not coming here anymore. Now, vice versa is part of the success, as Dave mentioned about the Washington football team getting a black player, is black fans are not involved in this too, right? And it is what we see today, as he talked about organization, it's really the fans pushing these teams, right? It's the people pushing these teams to do what's right? I don't think MLB, I don't think the NFL or any of these professional leagues, except the WNBA, say anything about Juneteenth in 2020 or ever if there's not a movement talking about Juneteenth. Now, I don't know what's going on in 2021, but I know in 2020, everyone had their Juneteenth day. I don't know if they're going to keep this up. But that's part of the people pushing them where they need to be. Some of these professional teams are very reactionary. And even so, when it comes to these professional sports teams in the 1960s, they had to be pushed, right, by local organizers, black organizers in these cities saying, wait a minute, you're not doing this. And then they got in front of this. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. And because there's a whole host of, when we talk about individuals and athletes and endorsements, but from the team perspective, that's where I think it's people pushing the teams to do what's right, but these teams also have the power. One last point. I think if the NFL really cared about, let's say, BLM or policing, they could force, if you're going to have the Super Bowl in your city, it needs to come with something, right? Because traditionally now, to get the Super Bowl, you probably have already built $1 billion stadium. But what is it coming with? What kind of organization are you doing with your local grassroots organizers to stop, right, police brutality or stop, anti-poverty campaign? So I think you could put more pressure on cities, these leagues can, than they do.
Thank you. David, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because so many of the examples that we've had are within the professional realm. And obviously, if we're talking about exploitation, conditions, and so much more, we have to have a conversation about collegiate athletics. That we are seeing, when we see the struggle for civil rights, when we see the struggle against exploitation and abuse, when we see the struggle against unsafe work conditions around COVID, we have seen the ways in which students who labor in the athletic fields of colleges across the nation are fighting back. We see the ways in which conversations are taking place across sports, between students at different schools in ways that we have not seen, or at least weren't visible before. And so we see these fights happening in the courts, but we also see it happening at a local level. And so when we talk about withholding labor, we can talk about both the ways in which that's taking place in the professional and the threats, whether it be various reports about how the Clippers several years back, and it, as a Lakers fan, it always hurts me to give a little positive anything to the Clippers, the way in which they potentially threatened to boycott a game, a playoff game, if something wasn't done about Donald Sterling. We can see it in various ways. And so the withholding of labor and the threats to profits are always going to be at the center of a fight, whether it be universities compensating student athletes or in the professional ranks.
Right, and the legal landscape of collegiate athletics is shifting right under our feet right now with the name, image, and likeness, the state bills versus the lack of a federal regulation, or NCAA not having any type of regulation yet, willing to make a stance on this, which is so interesting. Braden, what's your perspective as both, a former student athlete, but then now a professional athlete around the issues of your labor? And are there conversations, or were there in college, about the willingness to withhold it? Are there conversations now? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a pretty like in-depth issue that I know some student athletes are very passionate about, and some professional athletes are very passionate about. And then there's also some on the complete opposite side, which I always found very interesting, because like the whole like shut up and dribble is really adopted by a lot of athletes, more than you think. Because one, they're doing it because this is a means to make money, to support my family. And like, I'm just gonna, do my job, make my money, and then that's it. Like, I'm not gonna cause a problem. I'm not gonna stir the pot, because I know there's people way more powerful than me that have control of, my career, my family. In college, it's obviously a lot different because they're not making money. And people do have more control over your labor and also your voice. I think being a student athlete in a more progressive city, I saw more progressive athletes, 18 to 22-year-olds. And I always found it fascinating to hear them talk. One of them, I don't know if she's actually on the call, but she played soccer at UW. Her name's Havana. And, I was lucky enough to know her at school. And then we got back in touch maybe 6 or 8 months ago. And she was always on the front, pushing people, Black student unions, challenging the institution. And she still does it today. And I always found somebody like that so fascinating, because you could see how uncomfortable people in power would get. And her and I have talked about, okay, so how do we organize people like you all over the country together? Whether it's connecting college athletes together, whether it's connecting professional and college athletes, whether it's connecting activists or professors from certain parts of the country where these athletes go to school. Just trying to find these different avenues where we can enhance voice and challenge the institution without actually putting these athletes' career in jeopardy. Because at the end of the day, not everybody will go to the lengths that Colin Kaepernick went and said, look, this is right, and I don't care, about the football side of it. I'm gonna change history, and I'm gonna, move mountains that way. Not everybody wants to do that. And I think when Dawn was talking about it earlier, I think one of the reasons why NBA guys are more hesitant is because they're making so much money. And you'd think it'd be the opposite. And they would feel more inclined, like, I have more power, I can talk. But being in this world, I think it actually works the opposite, where, hey, I have my money, I'm gonna do my thing, stay in my lane. This team's paying me a lot of money. And so I think in terms of power structure and how that goes, I mean, that's happening with guys making, hundreds of millions. Imagine when you're not making anything, and you're 18 years old. It's obviously a very, like I said, interesting dynamic.
That is, thank you for that perspective. How do you think Louis, you mentioned fans as a major sort of support group that could help athletes use their voices. One question here is, with the Olympic Committee banning Black Lives Matter acknowledgement or kneeling, raising a fist, how would you advise athletes to speak out? So how can either collegiate athletes or other athletes in different realms where the organizing unit doesn't allow them to speak out, who can support them, and how can they find their voice?
It looks like Dave Zirin wants to answer this very much, and I'll stay away from the Olympics because he's the expert there. But I would say, in general, what athletes have to understand, there's no sport without them, right? right? They are the labor. And I think whenever you have those movements where athletes go on strike or right, it becomes the owners are, oh my gosh, because they know, right? They are the labor, right? And so if they come together as a unit, like Braden mentioned, 9 players from the Seattle Mariners, you can't touch them, right? If it's just that isolated figure, that's what's so hard. And then those are usually the people we celebrate, those isolated figures. But if it's the whole team wearing Paul Warnock, right? It's the whole league doing, or the Minnesota Leagues wearing Black Lives Matter, what are you going to do? And I think the best way then to approach this is to find allies, right? On your team across the campus. Now, it's a lot harder today because I think what colleges have realized is that if you keep players separate from the general population of the community, then you're going to avoid these things. So if we ever look at when these major colleges drop, what the football team has, and they have the lazy river, and they have the barbershop, and they have the recording studio, that's by design to keep those players right there and not talking to students who, when you're in college, you're 18, 22, what you do is you complain about the system, right? Whatever the system is to complain about. But if you keep them away from that, then they're not going to be impacted by that. And that's why Missouri in 2015 or 14 was so big, because the students got in touch with the athletes, and the athletes were part of this fraternity. And all of a sudden you had this potential huge labor strike on their hands. So again, it's you have to have athletes all on the same page. You have to have people supporting them, and then you'll be able to see great change. And I will pass this to Dave Zirin to talk about the Olympics.
Well, just thank you so much for the pass. Unlike your hero, Dominique Wilkins, you passed the ball. But just to say real quick, the thing about college athletes is I feel like they are the most powerful and powerless laborers in this country. They're both powerful and powerless. Powerless because they don't have a union. They have no way to collectively sit down at the table with with people like coaches in a way that actually they can determine their any sort of benefits or health. But they're also very powerful for the very reason that Professor Moore said with the Missouri example, because so much on the neoliberal campus, so it's a tentpole athletics in so many respects. And if the athletes in the revenue producing sports of football and men's basketball, if they decided we're not going to do this until you sit down with us, I mean, the system would be brought to its knees the same way the Missouri system was brought to its knees when players said racism is not acceptable on this campus. When the athletes joined with the students, the entire dynamic changed. Now, the reason why I sat up in my chair when you asked about the Olympics was because I just wrote an article about this and spoke to some athletes about it. And the International Olympic Committee, they really did step in it, because by banning the wearing of Black Lives Matter outfits, by reasserting their ban against kneeling or raising a fist, what they did was they have imbued any protest that does take place with tremendous risk and tremendous meaning. And that's a big deal, because I've spoken to athletes who've said things to the extent of taking a knee doesn't hit like it used to. Because it used to be you did it and you're Colin Kaepernick or you're a high school student and you're risking maybe your place on the team or your place in the league. But recently we've of course seen entire teams take a knee with coaches, with officials. And it's been more of a kind of a marketing look than it is an act of dissent. And for these Olympic athletes moving forward, they're now feeling the dissent in their hearts. They're feeling like, oh, you're telling me I can't do this? Well, then maybe I am going to do it. Because what the IOC did is they have imbued the idea of protest at these Olympics with the one thing that every protest needs to matter, and that's risk and that's rebellion. And so I think they made a tactical mistake. And there are some athletes now who are just feeling it in their heart. They're feeling the spirit that they actually have an obligation to go to Tokyo and say something.
Thank you for that. Let's go back to collegiate athletics, because I'm seeing a lot of questions in the Q&A or the chat box. How do you think NIL, and so for folks who don't know, name, image, and likeness is and has been an ongoing issue related to many Supreme Court cases actually about revenue sharing or revenue generation on behalf of the student athlete. If I, as a student athlete, want to start a clothing line or be an influencer. I can't do that. It violates NCAA and get compensation. It violates NCAA legislation. But the door is opening. So many states on July 1, I think it's Florida is the first that will open its the doors to NIL for college athletes. However, the NCAA still bans it. And there is a move towards federal legislation. So we'd have a holistic approach nationally, but it's not there. So my question is, and the question I'm posing from the Q&A box is, how do you think NIL, or the ability for students to do commercials and generate revenue while in college, how might that either lead to more social justice activism or, shut the doors, as Braden talked about, right? Is that if people are gonna get their money, they're not gonna do anything that's gonna hurt them. What do you all think about that? The role of NIL and social activism?
I think there's lots of things that we could say. But one, NIL's unfortunately is going to lead us, it lets universities and the NC2A off the hook. It's going to be, see, they're getting compensated. So the fundamental issue of exploitation, abuse, healthcare, collective bargaining, those are all things that need to be central to the discussion. And Bomani Jones talked about this last week on his show. So I'll just mention it. I think it's Georgia. Their legislation says that 75% of the NIL money can be put in a trust by the university to be distributed by the school itself. So that means, yet again, we're going to see a system where the institution is profiting or using the money in ways that takes away the power, agency, and control from student athletes, disproportionately Black student athletes.
So do you think that there could be an appropriate NIL legislation that could work to benefit student athletes, or are you thinking that it's just never going to work? It will always be used within the system, particularly if it goes through the university system, the structure, that it will always take advantage of student athletes in some way?
I'll go with the latter. If it goes through the system,
okay.
I am the NC2A and universities have demonstrated where their loyalties and priorities are, and they are not with students, and they are not with students who play sports. They are with profits. They're with corporate sponsors. They were with donors, and I'm skeptical. And that's not to say it's not a fight to have, and it's not part of a larger fight, but I think there's key elements in terms of collective bargaining, in terms of pushing aside the role of the university, because if the university is simply saying, hey, we're going to get this sponsorship of this student to pay for things that we don't have to, so we can pay our coach more, I don't know how that's progress.
Louis.
And I'll add to it. First, I'll say, look, when the NIL hits, no one's going to make more money than Paige Buchers, right? Like, she is the biggest star in all of college sports. And she's, and I don't, this is not a labor thing. She's going to be there for another 3 years, right? Unless some rules change. And I don't know, that's between Dawn and some other, the union, but she's going to be there, and she is legit the biggest star. So she's going to get paid, others will get paid, and I think that's a good thing. As they said, it lets the college off the hook, because they should be paying this labor. And what I think, what we'll start to see, especially with Georgia, and I always liken the college system to the plantation. And I mentioned this when I saw that Georgia thing on social media. It's like hiring time, and sometimes plantation, when it come after Christmas, come January, you hire out, you hire out your enslaved people to somebody else. They wouldn't get paid, and you would take, or maybe let's say they got paid something, but you would just give them a little, and you would take the rest of it. And I think that's what's going to happen to so many of these cases unless people push back. And I think when that information got out about Georgia, people pushed back. And you saw the University of Georgia, you saw Georgia Tech, oh, you're going to be able to keep your money. And I think the most fascinating thing is you asked that, what's going to happen to activism, right? And what we know by studying professional sports is we'll see a drop off in athlete activism once, you know, people start getting endorsements, right? Once OJ gets paid and people see that you can get extra money, because those guys weren't making a lot of money, and people are really quiet in the 70s and 80s, and then they see what happens to Craig Hodges, they see what happens to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. But when the Miami Heat wore the hoodie, right, in support of Trayvon Martin, and nothing happened to them, right, when it comes to endorsements. When LeBron can say whatever he wants on Twitter, right, and nothing's going to happen to him. And Cap, I went down to my local grocery store and bought some ice cream with Capnick on it. Right. I think there's a movement for these young kids to be involved in this. And I think they might be the ones to set the standards because they're 18, 22, and they're still in school and they're reading different books. And I think besides just getting that local core dealership, these youngsters are smarter than us. They're on the Instagrams or whatever they're on, and they know how to use it. And I think there's a potential there. What I worry about is that there's always that coach who will say, do X, Y, and Z, and you'll be fine. Because that's how the system is set up since 1973, since you had that 1-year renewable scholarship, right? It's set up to keep athletes in line, right? We'll pull the scholarship away if you protest what they say in the 70s, civil rights, women's rights, the Vietnam War. We'll pull the scholarship away. But now we'll see, because athletes can go to any school, right? If that portal, the athlete portal is open, what are you going to tell? So it's going to be very interesting. And for me, it all depends on who's in these student athletes' ears when it comes to branding themselves, right? Is it just going to be like Central Florida did? We'll put your social media on your jersey now, and you'll just be a brand. Or will they be students who are really into, like, you know what, I'm going to use my platform to say something about justice, and, you know, maybe I'll get something on the side for that.
I totally agree with you that the generations that are coming out now, they just have an expectation that they have a voice, that they can talk about social justice. I mean, we saw it with the NCAA basketball tournament, right? Where the women were like, look at what we got here. Look at what they got over there. And I'm not going to be quiet about it. I'm not going to pretend like this is okay, or that, yeah, you were making room in the ballroom for the equipment when you saw an empty room, you know, for the workout room. Anyway, and we see that with the younger people coming into the league now too, in the W. They're not going to be quiet. They have an expectation that they have a place in this world where they have a voice, and they expect their voice to be heard, and they're using their voices very effectively, and they're networking. Like you said, they're definitely connecting with each other now in a way that I don't think there was just no precedent for 10 years ago.
I'll go to another question, which you sort of touched on, but I want to put it out there. Moving to college sports, this past fall, we started seeing athletes banding together with demands, and there was speculation that we could start to see union-like formations. What do you think of this? What is the next step for social justice in college athletics? What's the role of unions? Do we see it happening at the college level? I mean, David, you sort of don't see sort of any sort of formulation of NIL that's going to work. That and even Louis, you likened college athletics to the plantation, right? So do you think that there's ever could be a fair version of college athletics where the students aren't being taken advantage from your perspective?
I think that
let's do Dawn.
Go ahead, Dawn. Go ahead.
The collective bargaining thing is crucial, right? Because NIL, there's only so many stars that are gonna make the big payday for their rights, right? What collective bargaining does is it creates a more fair platform for everyone, the ones who names you've never heard of. And I think that's why it's so important to think about how there could be collective bargaining in college, because that's how the broader base of athletes are going to benefit from, and are going to have an opportunity to get their just rewards for the labor that they put in. But NIL, I agree. I want Paige Buchers to be able to capitalize on, you know, her phenomenal talent, but you also want every other player on that team to have the same kind of treatment that she would expect, right?
Louis.
Yeah, no, and that'd be fun. We'll make a lot of money next year too. But I'll say this. Sorry about that. I lost my train of thought. When Paige comes up, I'm like, oh, this is the greatest player, and I hope she gets to play for the Seattle Storm in a few years. That's all I'll say until I get my train of thought.
Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the starting point for a college athletics that is less exploitative would honestly be the NCAA taking all the seats. I mean, I think if you had name, image, and likeness that was open, it would actually be, and it's just, that's the way it was. There's name, image, and likeness. It would be better and more fair than state governments getting involved, the federal government. They should just have the same rights as any other student. It's like, let's get the politicians out of it. Let's get the bureaucrats out of it. Let's get the NCAA out of it, and let the system operate organically on its own and see what happens. And then if we have to have regulation, we can do that. But this starting point that says we might have 50 different NIL laws because of 50 different state ideas, or we need the federal government to come in, to me, that's just NCAA cowardice. That's them passing the buck on what should be their fundamental duty as an NCAA. And if they're not going to do that, well, then why are they sucking up billions of dollars out of the system? Why is Mark Emmert making $4 million a year as NCAA president? Why does this institution exist if it's not going to exist to actually do something right now to make NIL rules clear and transparent and fair for everybody? So that's my frustration with both the NCAA and how I think NIL could work. I think that the exploitation piece in college sports would end if college athletes were treated as the campus employees that they are. You know, and that doesn't mean not taking classes. That doesn't, because there are all kinds of campus employees who take classes. My closest friend growing up does security at Florida State, and he's getting his degree right now. It's like, no, he's not being told you're doing security at the football games out of the goodness of your heart because you really care about football and, you know, Seminole pride and all the rest of it. And then you can also take classes. No, he's got a job that gives him access to free classes on campus. There's no reason why that shouldn't exist at the sporting level as well, because, but this is about, as been said, this is about control. It's not about fairness. It's not about equity. And it's not about, frankly, constitutionality. It's not about treating them like the way laborers are treated in the rest of this country, which frankly isn't great. But the NCAA and college athletics, it's like this carve out where they have this special designation, this legal designation called being a student athlete, which to me is a propagandistic term which covers up the actual relations at play.
Right. So that's where the notion of amateurism came up, right? Is to get away from the laws essentially, and the relationship between the employer and the employee. Louis.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on collective bargaining, it's hard because, you know, after what Northwestern did, states passed laws and said these student athletes can't do this. So I'm here in Michigan, and you know, the same month that, you know, the University of Michigan signed Harvard to a $48 million contract, they also passed a law that student athletes can't join these unions, right? So I mean, they know, right? The states are working with these people to make sure that these young student athletes don't get their piece of the pie, right? And that's the hardest part about it. And then amateurism is just like, it's the only place in America where we don't want to see these people make money, right? And it's crazy to me, right? And it used to be, I think it used to be really, it was class-based, right? It was how it comes over from Great Britain to the U.S. We follow, the middle class falls in love with amateurism, but they realize the working class is playing the sports, and then it becomes race, right? When post-World War II, when integration opens up, and now all of a sudden the majority of these athletes are starting to be Black, I think the conversation is, well, we got to keep this way, right? And not allow them to get paid. And to me, it's shameful. It's pathetic, right? These institutions make millions and millions of dollars. Coaches make 10 million. These young student athletes get nothing, right? And I know, look, some sports might go away, and that's how business works. And I think one of the great things about college campuses is that you have student-run sports, right? You have club sports. And if a sport, as an institution, maybe you can't afford a sport, then let it go club and let those student dollars, you know, prop that up. And as a professor, look, we have 3 club hockey teams. We don't have a hockey scholarship, and I treat them the same. Oh, you have a tournament in St. Louis? Okay, do your work, right? The same with our wrestling team, right? You know, I treat them as student athletes, right? So, because I think that's the wave, and that's the next movement is look, if you can't afford a program, then let it go. Don't make these majority sports that are Black majority subsidize these other sports. So some kid could play tennis, right? And that's just me, how I see the college campus. So.
Well, that's a great sort of summary. And let me put this last question on the table then, since we are, you know, in Zoom land on a university campus, right? And recognizing that universities may want to do more for their student athletes, but have the limitations put on them by the NCAA, by their conference, right? So there's layers of limitations in legislation that really confine what a university, and then there's the cultural norms, right? The norms around paying coaches more, right? I once asked the AD, not our current AD, why couldn't we cut someone's salary? And I got an earful on, well, then we can't be competitive, right? So there's these norms around what's competitive, what's the upper hand. So universities are stuck in this, but what can they do to center student athletes more, to treat them with more respect, to give them more rights, in your opinion? And I'll go, I think that I'll go through each of you, and Louis, why don't we start with you on that?
You know, I would say, and you know, Dr. Leonard might back me up on this, but I don't think the university is equipped. And if a YouTube professor, university's not equipped with this. And just being here, just, you know, every other week there's an email about diversity and inclusion. They don't really need it, right? Like, the university functions as a business. I'm sorry, it's like if my university's listening, and sorry, University of Washington, not you guys, but generally they function as a business, and the stuff they say is so the students don't get upset. And because they always know that those students will go here, they'll get mad, they'll say stuff, they'll put out the fire, and those students will graduate and they'll go through that process again. So I don't know if the university does really care about centering student athletes, right? It just sounds like lip service to me. And I'll say this: if this is the last thing I get to say on this roundtable, thank you, Braden. Make sure you study the greatest athlete, baseball player of all time, Eric Davis, and Dawn. You're so lucky to be so close to what will be the greatest female basketball player ever in Breonna Stewart. So this is the last thing I'm saying. This is thank you for having me. I'll shut up.
Okay, David, I'll go to you.
So this is a really important question. And I'm going to do something I don't do and be a little less cynical. And say there are things that can be done to not necessarily change the, you know, alter or really radically alter the way college sports operates. But there are things that universities can do to make the compensation and the experience for students who participate in sports, who labor in those playing fields. They can enhance that compensation. For example, if you are going to schedule games throughout the week, if students are going to be traveling a third of the quarter, you do not care about not only the compensation of education, but the compensation of a college experience. If students are being compensated with the opportunity to play, the opportunity to get a degree, learn education, and the opportunity to have a college experience, is that possible when you're away a third of a quarter, a third of the semester? So adjusting schedules, actually enforcing 20-hour rules, making things like clubs and internships available, all majors available. So, hey, that one class you need to be in that major that's always scheduled at 2:50, let's figure out a way. Those are things that can be done. And I'll leave this. This is a conversation I had with Victoria Jackson from Arizona State several years back. But what if when students were traveling, there was ways to integrate their travels into a class? And so for example, I had a student taking a class on hip hop. And while they traveled, they kept a journal as to all the ways in which they saw hip hop in the arenas they were playing, in the airports, in advertisements. So a way in which actually their learning was enhanced and bolstered because of their participation. These are not things that are dramatically altering the landscape, but at least it's a step towards actually making the interface between learning and sport possible.
I hear that. I appreciate that. And I do have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder as being at the University of Washington and the faculty athletic rep. And I do just am compelled to say that we are doing that here. You know, we are monitoring the majors and making sure folks aren't clustered in certain majors. We're working on the time schedule and classes. And we even had a great program when our students, basketball team went to the men's basketball team to China and had a whole class on to prep them to go. So there are ways, and I appreciate what you're saying, because if we put an emphasis, and we do, I'm going to say it again, center students, we can do those things within our institutions. But Braden, you're a student. You were a student recently. How has, what are your thoughts on this question? What could the university do more for you, for student athletes?
I mean, I think it's super interesting that David said that, because I ran into that exact problem. You know, like there was certain classes I'd want to take, but I remember it was practice, games, and it's like, at the end of the day, it was like, I'm getting pressure as an 18 to 21-year-old. Like, do you want to be a good player or do you want to be a good student? And unfortunately, it's like, not many people can do both. And, you know, I do think that is a problem. And I mean, I'm glad to hear that, you know, things at UW are progressing. So, you know, people can do that, because I mean, athletic schedules are incredible. There was a thought I had earlier about, I think one of the biggest problems that universities are going to run into in how they compensate players through the NIL is it's going to be left up to coaches at the end of the day who they recruit. And a lot of these coaches, their job is wins and losses, and they're going to say, okay, that's fine. You know, you can make your money however you want, but I'm not going to recruit you if you're, you know, out here on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, you know, because at the end of the day, coaches lose their job in 1 year after one bad year at a competitive university. So I think that's really going to be a problem, where players might lose out on opportunities because the coaches just don't want that headache. And then that kind of leads me into my next point of, I am not well equipped to talk about unionizing. You know, as a college, there's much more professional people on this panel that can do that. But I do think, and one of the things that I'm working on with two ex-athletes from UW is, how can we enhance the student athlete's voice enough to where they can organize to a point where they're felt throughout the country, and they can make demands as a group, not on their own. That's not going to put them in jeopardy individually. And there's obviously power in numbers. So like I kind of mentioned earlier, you know, connecting, you know, students at Creighton, you know, with activists in Omaha, you know, connecting athletes at the University of Texas with professors like yourselves, and giving them guidance of, okay, how can we make demands that make sense, that can be heard because we have power in these numbers. Obviously this sounds really good, you know, coming out of my mouth, and there's a lot of logistics behind it, obviously. But there's just so much unknown on the union side, and like how you can get student athletes to use their voice, you know, to get things done at that level, because it's just, you know, there's just too much power at the top and not enough at the bottom. And so I'm hoping that as time passes and organizations like what I've described can gain momentum, and I think they're coming from all different sides, that it'll give athletes a certain type of power and connection around the country, nationally, in so many different arenas, you know, sport, activism, and education, and then hopefully universities, you know, feel more pressure to actually make change on the athlete's behalf.
Great, thank you. Dawn.
I think it does. I'm really glad to hear that the UW is doing things to really help the student athlete be as a student and also as a human being. And I think it comes down to culture. And so if a university is providing a much better wraparound experience for an athlete than another university is, you're going to start to attract better athletes, or you're going to start to attract the top athletes, because they want more than just to be labor for that university. So aside from unionization and all of that, which is all an interesting part of the conversation, but it's about really deciding what you represent, you know, as a university, as a body, and the leadership instilling that culture in the coaches, as well as in the athletic organizations, as well as in the academic side of it, right? That there's an accommodation for that human being and their unique experience at that university. So I think David's point was really, really well stated, that it's not all about money, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's about making sure that you're recognizing the constraints or the issues that individual person is having, and you're trying to create an environment where they can be successful in a well-rounded way, not just athletically, but also academically, and as a human being participating in society. Because those are all things that I think universities are advertised as being the place to find those things in yourself. And so you have to really make sure that you're true to that culture is an important one, and that you're creating the systems and structures to support that culture.
Thank you for that. Dave.
Yeah, I think there's a foundational problem. It's kind of like, imagine a smoke machine, and when we talk about college athletics, we're all waving at the smoke instead of looking at stopping the machine. The foundational problem is that our institutions of higher learning are the minor leagues for the NBA and the NFL. And we're the only country that operates that way. And it leads to these ridiculous messes of things like unpaid labor, and how do you make sure that a student actually gets to go to class, and all of these things, which really, in a sane environment, we wouldn't be asking these kinds of questions. It would be obvious. So I think that's where the next discussion has to go. I mean, like the NFL needs to create some sort of pipeline for players who want to leave high school and be an NFL player. In basketball, you're already seeing it with the NBA's promotion of the G League, and with the creation of organizations like the PCL, which is very interesting, which is a new group that David West, former NBA player, is fronting, that's going to pay players basically to go to college and play basketball, and have going to class be part of the process by which they play basketball and get paid. It's a competitive institution, competitive against the NCAA, which is a huge deal because the NCAA has acted like a cartel for the entirety of its existence. This is an effort to crack that cartel. And so I think that that's where the discussion needs to be. It's like, what kind of pipelines to professional sports should exist, and what kind of sports should exist on the college campus, and figuring out how to make that work, and not trying to, as I like to think of it, make a dog meow.
Thank you for that. This continuum of perspectives are so interesting. I think, David, with the Alston case, we'll see that. We'll see more sort of, we have to, from this, Supreme Court decision, opening up of what the universities can give to students. So I appreciate this conversation. I just want to say two things. This conversation was recorded, and so the history department will distribute that. I also want to just plug the UW Athletic Department will be having a similar conversation in exactly 2 weeks from today, on the 26th at 5 o'clock. So if folks are interested in our own former student Braden Bishop will participate on that panel, and I'll also be on that panel. We'll have Coach Jimmy Lake as well as a current student athlete. And the DEI Associate Athletic Director. So we will continue this conversation, and I think many folks will be interested in some of those themes that come up. So thank you all so much. I know you're all very, very busy folks, and we appreciate you carving out the time to spend with us and engage in this really, thoughtful conversation. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to turn it over to history at this point, but I will be a history professor in the moment and just say thank you on behalf of the history department for attending this conversation. It was really nice to meet you all. Take care.